It was not the kind of place you'd expect to find a secret, no forgotten cemetery, no sunken shipwreck, no ruins left by a civilization no one remembers, just a stretch of forest in western Oregon green, in every direction the kind of green that swallows sound. It was early spring 2025 when the stillness broke. A construction crew was clearing a path for a logging road cutting into the edge of forest land that had gone untouched for decades. Chainsaws hummed in the distance, but here in this hollow where the ground dipped, it was just one man and his excavator. He swore later that the first sign was the way the earth sounded when the bucket scraped it, a hollow for solid ground. The second sign was the smell, a strange mix, cold metal, stale air, and something faintly sweet, like flowers pressed between the pages of a book for too long. He stepped down from the machine, brushing the dirt away with gloved hands, and the shape revealed itself, slowly, stubbornly, as if the ground did not want to give it up. What emerged first was a curve, a dull gleam under the grime, not rock, not root metal. A moment later the outline became clear, a seamless, rounded shell the size of a small cabin buried 4 feet under the soil. The man fetched a crowbar, knocked gently on the surface, and froze. The sound was wrong, muted, as if the metal hid something soft inside. By the time the sheriff's office arrived, he had cleared away enough dirt for them to see what it was, a seam running in a perfect oval traced around the shell. No hinges, no locks, no weld marks, just one continuous piece of steel, old but uncorroded. It took hours before they managed to breach it. The final cut sent a hiss of pressurized air into the clearing, carrying a smell of moss, extinguished campfire, and something old, ran air that hadn't touched daylight in decades. The deputies' flashlights cut through the gloom, and the beam fell on fabric canvas, pale brown with age, but still intact. It was a tent, an old-fashioned, heavy-frame, military-style tent, the kind popular in the late 80s. Suddenly, this one was sealed from the inside. Its zippers were fused shut as if melted by heat, but the fabric bore no burn marks. The scene was unnatural in every way. There were folding chairs, a lantern, sleeping bags still laid out in neat rows, a deck of cards on the ground midway through a game, cans of beans stacked beside a small propane stove. No signs of struggle, no signs of rot, not even dust. The deputy nearest the opening glanced at his watch and frowned. It's cooler in there, he murmured, and it was several degrees colder than the spring air outside. With a stillness so complete it pressed against the eardrums. The man who had found it stood at the edge of the pit, arms crossed tight. He told reporters later, it looked like they had just stepped outside, like they were coming back any minute. But it's been 36 years. A reporter from Portland flipped through old police records, trying to remember why the scene felt familiar. She found the case in a dusty archive. 16 campers missing, June 1989. The names were there, typed in block letters alongside the grainy, sun-faded photographs of smiling young faces in flannel shirts and baseball caps. The official report had marked the case unsolved. No bodies, no gear recovered, no witnesses, just an abandoned campground. And the eerie fact that all 16 had vanished without a trace until now. The footage shown on the evening news was brief. Officials shoot away cameras after the first few minutes, but one detail slipped through. Before the feed cut on the tent's flap, faint and crooked, someone had written in thick black marker, "Don't let it out," and then the screen went black. The summer of 1989 in Oregon was the kind that made you believe nothing bad could happen here. The mornings smelled of pine resin and lake water, and in the afternoons the air shimmered above the blacktop roads, as if even the heat wanted to dance. No one arriving at Crescent Pines campground that Friday could have imagined their faces would one day be printed on missing person posters, or that their names would be spoken in the same breath as words like unsolved and gone. They came in clusters, in beat-up sedans and sun-faded station wagons, the trunks heavy with sleeping bags, fishing rods, and coolers packed in melting ice. Some had been here before, others had only heard of it from friends. Saw friends. It wasn't an official campsite, more of a local secret, a clearing by the lake with just enough space for tents and just enough isolation for those who wanted to disappear for a weekend. There were 16 of them in all. Eleanor Ellie Carr, 24, drove up first, a barista from Portland who had a habit of folding tiny origami cranes out of any scrap of paper she could find. She parked by the tree, stepped out barefoot, and tilted her head like she was listening to the forest breathe. Then came Danny and Paul Reardon, brothers with matching sunburned forearms, who immediately began arguing over which fishing spot was the real one. Their dad used to take them to. A little later, a blue hatchback pulled in, carrying 3 college roommates from Eugene, Leah, Shiloh, and Mark, armed with a disposable camera, a battered guitar, and enough marshmallows to feed an army. By sundown, the group had grown into a loose patchwork of personalities. A quiet man in his 40s named Curtis, who kept to himself whittling wood by the fire, a young couple, Maria and Lyle, whose laughter came in bursts like they were trying to prove something to each other, two women from Seattle, June and Willa, who were traveling down the coast and just happened to hear about this place from a gas station attendant. No one kept track of who invited who. That was the magic of a campsite like this. It belonged to no one and everyone at once. The first evening was golden. The lake caught the sunset and threw it back in shards of copper and rose. Someone strung a hammock between two pines. Someone else found a half-buried horseshoe and declared an impromptu game. Conversations drifted easily. Music, bad jobs, dreams too big for small towns. In the way these things often go, strangers became confidants under the orange glow of the campfire. Leah taught Ellie how to play a clumsy chord on the guitar. June passed around a flask of something sharp that burned, but warmed the chest. Only one thing broke the rhythm. Danny swore he heard a voice just before dark from somewhere beyond the tree line. Not yelling, not whispering, more like someone talking low as if to themselves. He stepped into the brush, called out, waited. Nothing. Paul told him it was probably the wind. Danny said the wind didn't sound like it was telling a story. No one thought much of it. Then the second day dawned. Flawless mist lifted from the lake like it was making room for the sun. Breakfast was pancakes on a portable griddle, eaten cross-legged on camp chairs. But the forest was not still. If you stood far enough from the fire pit, you could hear it, layers of sound stacked like wet leaves, birdsong, the low hiss of wind, and underneath something softer, slower, a creak, without a source, a thump that came not from above, but from below. Ellie noticed it while collecting water in a plastic jug. She turned in slow circles trying to locate the origin, but the sound always seemed to shift, just out of reach. By midday, a few others admitted they'd heard things, two footsteps pacing just beyond sight, branches snapping, even though no one had gone that way. Theories were tossed around, maybe another camping group, maybe deer, maybe some local pulling a prank. But Curtis, the man with the carving knife, shook his head. If it's deer, he said. They're walking in circles. That night, the fire burned lower, the laughter softer. People stuck closer to the light, eyes darting to the edges of the clearing. The tree line felt thicker now, the spaces between trunks darker. Shiloh swore she saw a shadow move against the direction of the wind. Willa heard tapping, 3 slow knocks on the canvas of her tent just before midnight. While trying to laugh it off, walked the perimeter with a flashlight. He returned, pale, said he saw nothing, but kept glancing over his shoulder. For the rest of the night, no one admitted it then, but a shared thought was creeping in. Something was aware of them, and the photographs later recovered from the disposable camera. The change is subtle, but unmistakable. The first day shots are loose, bright, wide smiles. By the second night, their postures are smaller, eyes unfocused, shoulders drawn in. It's as if they'd already begun to fold inward, like the trees were closing in two. And somewhere in those last few frames, though no one noticed it then, there is a blur in the background, not quite a person, not quite a shadow, something that shouldn't have been there. No one knows the exact hour it happened, not even the forest. If the forest could speak, would admit to it. The last time all 16 campers were accounted for was just after sundown on the third night. They had eaten late, huddled close to the fire. No one strayed to the edges of the clearing anymore. Even laughter, when it came, was short and brittle, as though the trees might overhear. The fire burned lower. Shiloh strummed the guitar once or twice, but no one sang. Ellie passed around a thermos of coffee. It tasted metallic, but they drank it anyway. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone branch cracked loud enough to make them all glance up at once. The next morning, there was nothing, not nothing like an empty campground, nothing like a stage set after the actors have walked off. Still lit, still warm. The fire pit was cold, but the kettle still had water in it, half full and faintly steaming in the early sun. Sleeping bags were laid out in neat rows inside the tent, their shapes dented as if bodies had just risen from them minutes earlier. The card game was still mid-hand, a 3 of hearts resting in the dirt between 2 chairs, but there were no people. The search teams came within hours. Deputies, park rangers, volunteers from the nearby town, men and women in bright jackets moving through the pines in tight, disciplined lines. They called out names, they blew whistles. They found no trail leading away from the site, no footprints in the loam, in the soft earth around the tent. Only the campers' own prints remained, dozens of them, overlapping, all ending abruptly at the edge of the clearing, like 16 people had walked to the same point and vanished the lake, was dragged twice, nothing the shoreline, held no clues, no scuffs, no fallen belongings, no indication anyone had entered the water. Dogs were brought and trained to track human scent. They circled the clearing once, whining, then sat down and refused to move. One handler swore the dogs wouldn't even look toward the tree line, as if something there repelled them. A deputy found a child's shoe halfway between camp and the riverbank. It belonged to Leah. Her parents confirmed it later. It was clean too, clean, no dirt on the sole, no pine needles clinging to the laces, as if it had been placed there rather than dropped. Over the next 48 hours, the search widened. Helicopters scanned the forest canopy. Divers combed through hidden coves along the lake. The camp itself was photographed, bagged, and cleared. Every item was documented except for one detail which never made it into the official reports. The main tent's entrance was zipped shut from the inside. The zipper pull was warped, fused at the teeth, as though it had been exposed to intense heat. And yet the canvas showed no burn marks. Curtis' carving knife was found beside his sleeping bag. Next to it was the small wooden figure from the stone pile at the forest edge, only now the figure's arms were bent differently, folded tight against its chest. In interviews years later, some of the searchers admitted they had the distinct impression while moving through the forest that they were being mirrored, every step forward echoed by something just out of sight, matching their pace exactly. One ranger told his wife that on the second day of the search, he saw a movement, a tall shape between the trees, motionless for a long beat, then gone. He didn't report it. He wasn't sure anyone would believe him. After 4 days, the search was officially scaled back. By the 7th day, it was over. The official report labeled it a mass disappearance of undetermined cause. Locals gave it a name, the Crescent Pines. Vanishing families came for weeks afterward, setting up folding chairs at the edge of the clearing, as if waiting for someone to simply walk out of the trees. No one ever did. Years past, the campsite was slowly reclaimed. Moss grew over the fire pit, stones, saplings rose where tents had once stood. The only trace was a faint, unnatural clearing where grass refused to grow even in high summer, until decades later a construction crew's excavator bucket struck steel under the soil. Time is a poor keeper of secrets. It erodes stone, it eats away at memories, it turns sharp edges into smooth ones. But here, where the pines grow tall enough to scrape the clouds, time had done something stranger. It had preserved the absence. The Crescent Pines vanishing didn't become a national obsession. It never made the cover of Time or got its own primetime special. It was too strange, too incomplete. No suspects, no evidence, not even bodies to mourn. It lived instead in the margins, regional news columns, whispers in diners, the kind of local legend teenagers dared each other to visit at night. For a while, the case sat in a gray filing cabinet in the back office of the Lane County Sheriff's Department. The photographs curled at the edges. The paper began to yellow. Names were misspelled in old clippings, details warped in retellings. For the families, the years unfolded in uneven ways. Some refused to move from the towns they'd been living in when their loved ones vanished, afraid that leaving might mean missing the day they returned. Others fled entirely, unable to stand driving past the exit sign for Crescent Pines. A few became archivists of their own grief, collecting every article, every rumor, every half-baked theory in boxes that would one day sag under their own weight. On anniversaries, some still came to the forest, standing at the tree line, as if the missing might step out smiling, carrying their camping gear, as though 36 years were nothing at all. In the early 2000s, a local paper ran a retrospective. 15 years gone. The writer visited the clearing. By then, nature had claimed most of it. Grass grew knee-high. The fire pit stones were sunken, and moss-covered saplings had risen in the spaces where the tents once stood. The writer described a peculiar quality to the air, cooler in the clearing than in the surrounding forest, even under the sun, and a silence that wasn't empty, but layered, as though the place was still listening. In the mid-2010s, a true crime blogger stumbled on the case while researching missing person clusters in the Pacific Northwest. Her article went viral briefly, mostly because of a single photograph she found in the archives: 16 smiling faces around a campfire, the edges of the image blurred, as though something had moved behind the photographer. She titled her piece "The Camp That Never Came Home." The comments section filled with half-serious speculation: government experiments, Bigfoot, alien abduction, mass hysteria. One commenter claimed their uncle had been a volunteer in the original search and had come home with scratches down both arms, insisting they'd been made by branches, though had been searching a stretch of forest with no underbrush. Still, the story faded again. Years stacked on years, the case remained cold, but the forest never forgot. By 2025, the Crescent Pine site was barely a rumor. The original clearing was invisible to all, but those who knew exactly where to look. The trees had thickened into a wall, their roots twisted deep into the soil where the last traces of human presence lay buried. It should have stayed that way. It would have if not for the decision to cut a logging road through that exact stretch of forest. One strike of a steel excavator bucket, one hollow clang in the earth, and the secret the pines had been holding for 36 years was pulled into daylight in the weeks after the 2025 discovery. Old wounds tore open, family members now gray-haired, voices softened by time, were interviewed for the first time in decades. Some cried openly on camera, some refused to speak at all. One man, brother to two of the vanished, said simply, "I thought the forest had eaten them. I never thought it would spit them back out." The tent had not been found where it was left in 1989. It had been moved, buried, sealed, and whatever had been placed inside with it had been locked away as tightly as the tent itself. The thing about digging something out of the earth is this: you never really know if you're unearthing it or if you're letting it out. The construction crew stood well back now, their heavy machinery idling a good 30 feet away. The logging company had ordered the work halted until law enforcement arrived. The metal shell sat in the center of the churned dirt, streaked with claw marks from the excavator's bucket. Where it had first struck the surface, it was larger than it had appeared in the ground, nearly 12 feet long, 6 feet wide, a seamless rounded casing without bolts, rivets, or hinges. The surface wasn't polished, but it wasn't corroded either. 36 Oregon winters should have eaten it alive. It had no right to look this intact. Sheriff and McClure walked slow circles around it, her breath visible in the cool morning air. She tapped it once with the butt of her flashlight. The sound came back, deep, muted, like there was weight inside. But the weight wasn't shifting. The crime scene unit arrived before noon. They set up a ring of floodlights, the harsh white glow clashing with the shadowed forest. Photographers circled the shell, capturing every scratch, every imperfection. There weren't many. When they ran a metal analyzer across the surface, the reading made one tech whistle. Low. The alloy's composition didn't match anything they had in standard database. It had trace elements used in aerospace manufacturing, but not in the late 1980s. The forensics lead muttered under his breath, "This wasn't made when they vanished." Breaking into it wasn't easy. The first plan was to cut through with a high-powered angle grinder. The sparks flew, but the metal barely groaned under the blade. After 20 minutes, they'd made an incision no longer than a wrist. The next attempt involved industrial drills. Again, slow progress, as though the shell was resisting out of more than just physical toughness. Finally, they brought in a plasma cutter. The operator's visor lit in bursts of white-hot fire as the torch traced along the seam. The cut took nearly 2 hours. When the final section of metal gave way, the air changed. It came out in a hiss, cool and stale, carrying with it a faint scent of extinguished campfire pine sap, and something else, something almost sweet. The officers nearest the opening stepped back instinctively, as though expecting something to crawl out. Floodlights tilted toward the breach. What they saw first was not bone or bodies, but fabric, a tent canvas thick and old-fashioned, stretched taut over an internal frame. Its surface was brown with age, but without tears, without mold. It stood on what looked like a base of compacted earth, though no moisture seeped in from below. The entry flap was zipped shut. The zipper's metal teeth were fused together midway down. The pull tab warped into an unrecognizable curl. No signs of scorching on the fabric itself. One deputy knelt, touching the tent wall with the back of his gloved hand. He said later it was colder inside the tent than it was in the air around them. It took delicate work to open the flap without destroying it. They slid scissors between the fused teeth, cutting a narrow slit. The beam of a flashlight swept in first. The interior was pristine. Sleeping bags were arranged in neat parallel lines, each with a folded blanket at the foot. A propane stove sat off to one side, a kettle still resting on its grate. A deck of cards lay in a half-played game. A flashlight lay beside one bag, its casing faded, but its bulb unbroken. The strangest part was the absence of dust, not a speck on the floor, the gear, or the lantern hooks overhead. It was as if time had been paused the moment the last person left in had never started again. Sheriff McClure crouched inside her boots, silent on the packed floor. She ran her light across each corner, across the faces of objects that should have aged, dulled, rusted. Her radio crackled outside. Someone from the lab team wanted her to see something at the far rear of the tent. Stitched into the inner lining was a small zippered compartment inside a backpack, and inside that backpack a cassette tape recorder wrapped in a flannel shirt. The shirt smelled faintly of campfire. The tape inside was labeled only with a date, June 29th. 1989, the day before the disappearance was reported. One of the texts suggested playing it on-site. McClure shook her head. Chain of custody, she said, but her eyes didn't leave the recorder for the rest of the dig. By dusk, the tent had been lifted out of the steel shell with a sling and transferred to a climate-controlled evidence truck. The shell itself remained in the pit, a hulking mute thing that reflected the floodlights in dull, uneven glints. One of the younger deputies, standing at the edge of the pit, asked what they thought it was. For a forensic tech, glanced over, voice low. It wasn't built to protect what's inside from us. A pause. It was built to protect us from what's inside. The cassette sat on the evidence table in a sterile, windowless room at the Lane County Sheriff's Department. It was smaller than anyone expected, its clear plastic edges slightly yellowed with age. The tape reels inside wound tight. The label was handwritten in smudged black marker, June 29th. 1989. Camp. For nearly a week after the tent's recovery, it stayed sealed in an evidence bag. The chain of custody was meticulous. No one wanted to be the person who mishandled the only first-hand record from the missing 16. On a quiet Wednesday morning, Sheriff and McClure gave the nod. Two evidence techs set up a digitizer, feeding the tape through so it could be preserved in a clean digital file. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper dust. No one spoke. As the recorder was switched on, tape begins. The first 30 seconds are muffled ambience, boots on dirt, the sound of a kettle lid clinking, someone humming tunelessly in the background, then a man's voice, warm, conversational. All right, night 3 out here. Cards are a 4-3. I think Leah's winning. Fire's still going. Pretty sure Paul's cheating. Laughter in the background. There's a scrape of metal on metal. Someone moving a folding chair. A woman's voice cuts in. You're not recording everything, are you? The man, nah. Just little bits. Feels I dunno. Good to have it like proof. We were here. The next 2 minutes are campfire chatter, snippets of conversation about fishing, a joke about someone snoring, the sound of the guitar from earlier sections, the kind of sounds that make you ache to be there. Then a shift somewhere behind. The voices faint and almost indistinguishable. There's something, not wind, not an animal, a low steady hum like a power line in the distance, only deeper. No one on the tape mentions it. Not yet. At the 543 mark, the man's voice lowers. Okay, I don't think it's the wind this time. There's a pause, and in the background you can hear the fire crackle, and then faintly 3 soft knocks, steady, evenly spaced, close enough that the recorder picks up the vibration in the tent pole. A woman whispers, did it do that last night? Another voice marks, maybe murmurs, it's closer. For a moment the group tries to joke through it. Someone says it's the ghost of a lumberjack, and there's nervous laughter, but the tension bleeds through their voices. You can hear it in the way the words get clipped in the silences between sentences. At 812, there's movement, footsteps circling the tent, slow and deliberate. Someone whispers, don't look. The hum grows louder. It's not constant, Anna Marie. It pulses like something breathing. At 9:50, one of the women gasps, there's a sound like a zipper moving, only no one is near the tent flap. Another voice, urgent, but hush, don't unzip it, don't. The hum stops abruptly, and for 15 seconds there's complete silence. When sound returns, it's chaos, but muted chaos, like the recorder is under a blanket. You hear rapid breathing, the metallic clatter of something being dragged across the ground, a muffled shout that could be a name. The mic pops twice as if the recorder has been jolted hard, then clearly two clearly overlapping voices, all speaking at once. It's here. The words are layered, distorted, almost harmonized, like more than one person is saying them in the exact same rhythm. They repeat it again and again and again until it's no longer language, just a sound. Your brain tries and fails to untangle. The last thing on the tape is not a voice, it's a single low tone, so deep it rattles the playback equipment, so resonant it feels like it's inside your bones instead of in your ears. Then tape ends. When the recording finished in that windowless evidence room, no one moved for a full 30 seconds. The audio tech stared at the waveform on the screen as if expecting it to change. McClure just sat back, her hands clasped loosely in front of her mouth, the tips of her fingers going white. The official transcript entered into evidence was heavily redacted in the public release. The overlapping voices were described simply as unintelligible. The deep tone at the end wasn't mentioned at all outside of official channels. The recording leaked within a month. People who listened claimed different things. Some swore they heard their own name whispered in the background. Others said the final tone matched infrasonic frequencies known to cause nausea, panic, and hallucinations. One listener reported dreams where the missing campers stood in a ring around a fire, all facing inward, swaying to something no one else could hear. If the cassette tape was a voice from the past, the steel shell was the silence around Ida's silence, built not grown. In the days following the discovery, the shell was moved in sections to a secure forensic facility in Salem. The process took 3 flatbed trucks and a police escort. Even cut apart, each piece was heavy enough to bow the trailer beds. The technicians expected corrosion, pitting some evidence of weathering after 3 decades. Underground, they found none under the harsh light of the lab. The surface was revealed in unsettling detail, a matte texture that seemed to absorb light, instead of reflecting it, a faint striation pattern running diagonally across each piece, too precise to be natural, too irregular to be machine-tooled. One metallurgist ran a finger along the cut edge, then withdrew his hand quickly. Later, he told a colleague it felt warm, though it had been in a climate-controlled room for hours. The first chemical analysis confused the lab. The alloy was mostly steel, but with trace inclusions of elements not used in commercial metallurgy until decades after 1989. Vanadium, in specific ratios, microscopic particles of a titanium compound patented in 2003, and something else that defied immediate classification. The something else was crystalline, not metallic, embedded in the steel, as if grown there. It didn't match any known mineral sample. One of the younger techs half-joked, either somebody built this after they vanished, or somebody built it before we could. No one laughed. The seams were the real puzzle. There weren't a 90 weld lines, no rivets, no evidence of assembly. It was as if the shell had been cast in a single pour, but with no sprues, no gating marks, no sign of how molten metal could have been shaped so perfectly. The lab's lead engineer described it in his report. The structure behaves like an object designed for containment, not habitation. The mass-to-volume ratio suggests shielding properties far beyond what would be needed for environmental protection. It is overbuilt deliberately, so when asked to elaborate on shielding, he hesitated, then said it's less about keeping something safe from the outside and more about keeping something on the inside from leaking out. Word leaked quickly. Conspiracy forums lit up with theories, government blacksite experiments in the late 80s, early prototypes for deep space, environmental pods, secret Cold War tech meant to store hazardous biological material. Others went further, pointing to grainy photos of the excavation site and claiming the crystalline inclusions in the steel were starborne meteoritic material worked into the metal intentionally. Sheriff McClure requested that the shell be tested for residual radiation. The readings came back normal, except for one anomaly. Sensitive EM scanners picked up an ultra-low frequency hum emanating from the steel itself. It was faint, so faint it barely registered above the noise floor, but it was consistent across every section, as though the metal was still resonating with something it had once been in contact with. When the audio tech from the tape lab got wind of this, he ran a comparison. The low tone at the end of the cassette matched the hum exactly. Theories multiplied. If the tone and the steel shared a frequency, maybe the sound wasn't just a sound, it was a lock or a signal or a side effect of whatever sealed the tin away. Some in the department began quietly suggesting that the tent and its contents be returned to the shell and reburied. Others argued that would destroy the best chance of solving a 36-year-old mystery. McClure's own notes, later obtained through a leaked memo, read, "I'm starting to think we dug up more than a tent. I think we dug up a threshold." There was one more discovery, and it didn't come from a lab. A retired ranger named Thomas Rourke, who had been part of the original 1989 search, contacted the sheriff's office. He claimed that 3 days into the search, his team found a patch of ground that felt hollow, like there was something big under it. They'd marked it with tape to come back later, but when they returned the next morning, the ground was solid again, undisturbed, as if the hollow had collapsed or moved. When shown photographs of the shell from the 2025 dig, Rourke reportedly went pale and said, "That's it, only it's smaller now." The moment the first photographs leaked online, the case left the control of the Lane County Sheriff's Department. The Crescent Pines vanishing was no longer just a cold fillet, it was currency in the economy of obsession. On conspiracy forums, the shell became known as the Oregon capsule. Some swore it was an experimental deep earth shelter from the late Cold War, abandoned after the Soviet collapse. Others linked it to a string of buried structure sightings across the Pacific Northwest. Buried domes found in clearings, sometimes made of concrete, sometimes of metal. A fringe contingent went further, claiming the crystalline inclusions in the steel were extraterrestrial, and that the capsule was designed to preserve non-terrestrial biologicals in stasis. For locals, the theories were stranger and quieter. Older residents remembered the search in '89 the way the deputies avoided answering certain questions. One woman who had been 16 that summer said she'd been camping a few miles from Crescent Pines and woke one night to see a column of pale light in the forest. She'd thought it was moonlight at first until she realized it was moving, sliding through the trees without touching the branches. A former volunteer searcher, now in his 60s, admitted that had heard voices in the forest during those first frantic days, voices calling his name in the tone of his late father. When Head tried to follow them, he found himself walking in circles until the sound faded. He never told anyone until now. The families of the missing split sharply on how to handle the discovery. Some begged the sheriff's office to seal the tent and shell away forever, arguing that disturbing it further risked something unnamed but deeply feared. Others pushed for complete transparency, wanting every photograph, every lab result, every frame of evidence released to the public. For those still holding on to the idea that the campers might have survived, somehow caught in some form of time anomaly or fold in the forest, the discovery was both hope and torment. If the tent was preserved, could they be too? And if so, where? In the digital world, the obsession took on a life of its own. Amateur sleuths began cross-referencing the tape's audio with environmental recordings from the area. They claimed to find the same low hum in other forests, even in other countries. Red-stitched maps of hum zones appeared online, with Crescent Pines marked in bold red. YouTubers filmed night investigations in the woods nearby, playing copies of the cassette's final tone into the darkness and swearing they saw movement just beyond their lights. None of them went near the actual excavation site. It had been fenced off and posted with no trespassing signs, but that didn't stop stories from spreading about people hearing footsteps just outside their tents, miles away from where the shell had been found. The official investigation remained silent on most points. McClure gave only one press conference, standing in front of a bank of microphones under a gray Oregon sky. The evidence recovered is still under analysis, she said evenly. We will release confirmed information when we have it. Anything else you hear is speculation. When a reporter asked her point-blank if she believed the capsule was man-made, she hesitated just for a fraction of a second before repeating no comment. Meanwhile, private conversations within the department grew darker. One detective assigned to review the old case files noticed a strange detail. The witness list from 1989 included the name of a geologist working in the area that summer. When they tried to track him down, they found his entire professional history had gone missing. No licensing records, no academic citations, nothing except a single blurry photo of a man in his 50s standing beside a steel cylinder half buried in the ground, dated 1971. And then there were the dreams several people connected to the excavation reported. Then McClure, 2 techs from the metal lab, even the crane operator who lifted the tent from the shell. They described the same scene, standing in a ring of tall pines, the ground beneath their feet pulsing faintly, and 16 figures standing just inside the shadows. In the dream, none of the figures spoke, but all of them swayed slowly in unison, as if to a rhythm no one else could hear. One of the techs resigned 2 days after having the dream. He left a note on his desk: "It's not just in the ground, it's in the air." The film roll had been found in a side pocket of a canvas rucksack during the cataloging of the tent's contents. The rucksack belonged to Leah. Her name was stitched into the inner flap in blue thread, the kind of careful embroidery someone's grandmother might have done inside a few crumpled receipts from a gas station in Eugene. A small spiral notebook filled with grocery lists and doodles, and the undeveloped roll of Kodak Gold 200 in 2025. Developing a roll like that wasn't standard procedure for the sheriff's office, but McClure insisted if there were images from the days before the disappearance, they might contain something the cassette hadn't captured, something the human eye had noticed, even if no one had spoken it aloud. The film lab handled it like a fragile relic, coaxing the images into being frame by frame. The first few photographs were exactly what you'd expect: Ellie crouched by the fire pit laughing at something just out of frame, Paul holding up a trout with both hands, his grin wide, and boyish Shiloh mid-song, the neck of the battered guitar catching the sunlight, a shot of the lake at sunset, the water a flat mirror of orange and violet. These were the images of a summer untouched by what was coming. By the middle of the roll, the tone shifted. Smiles were still there, but smaller, more forced. In one frame, Maria and Lal stand side by side, their shoulders touching, but their hands clenched into fists. In another, June and Willa sit in the hammock, heads turned toward the tree. Lean instead of the camera, and in one image slightly out of focus Mark is captured glancing over his shoulder, his mouth open mid-question, as if interrupted. The background blur, seems off, the light doesn't behave quite right, shadows bending in directions that don't match the sun. The second to last frame was taken in front of the tent. All 16 campers are visible, arranged in a loose semicircle, faces caught mid-laugh, as if someone had just cracked a joke. It's warm, human, familiar until your eyes adjust to the background. Between two pines in the narrow gap just left of center, there is a figure. At first glance, it looks like another person, tall, thin, standing very still, but the longer you look, the less it resolves. There are no facial features, no visible folds of clothing, no shadows that match the angle of the others. Its outline seems to shimmer, as though it's caught between existing and not existing, a ghost image bleeding into the film grain. When the lab enlarged it, the texture of the figure didn't match the rest of the photography. It wasn't made of the same light. It was as though the camera had recorded it in a different spectrum entirely. One the human I couldn't have seen in the moment. The final frame on the roll was almost completely dark. A faint orange glow in the lower right suggested firelight, but the rest was black. When the lab digitally lifted the shadows, more of the scene emerged: pine trunks, the faint curve of the tent wall, the glint of a metal lantern hook, and in the far left corner, only half in frame, was the edge of the same figure, closer, now its form stretching upward into the dark as though it had been moving toward the photographer. When the shutter clicked, the lab report described the anomalies: clinically possible double exposure or chemical degradation of emulsion. Non-human figure in frames 22 and 24 lacks identifiable human morphology. McClure's private notes were less detached. If this was a person, they were standing completely still in both shots. If it wasn't a person, then what the hell was it doing there? Twice when the photographs were shown to the family's reactions ranged from disbelief to open fear. Leah's mother stared at the semicircle group photo for a long time before asking quietly, why didn't they notice it? Some of the search volunteers from 1989 refused to look at the enlarged image of the figure at all. One of them, Thomas Rourke, the retired ranger who'd spoken about the hollow ground, shoved the photo back across the table and said that's where it was standing. I told you, it just waits. The image leaked online. Within days, skeptics called it a hoax, an easy Photoshop trick, but those who had been following the case closely noticed something. The shimmer around the figure's outline matched the distortion visible in the digitized audio file of the cassette. During the low hum, someone overlaid the two patterns, one in light, one in sound. They lined up. The excavation site should have looked like a wound in the earth. Raw soil, machinery tracks, the exposed pit where the steel shell had been lifted out for 2 weeks after the dig. That's exactly what it was. Then one morning, it wasn't. The change was first noticed by a survey crew sent in to map the land for the ongoing logging project. They expected to find the pit still open, the surrounding earth trampled and scarred. Instead, they found nothing but level ground. The soil where the pit had been was firm, densely packed, as though it had settled for decades. Grass, short, pale, and new, was already sprouting across the surface. The machinery tracks were gone, the churned mud replaced by undisturbed layers of pine needles and leaf litter. It wasn't just that the site looked untouched, it looked older than before the excavation had ever happened. When photographs from before and after were compared, the tree line seemed subtly different. Saplings that had been cleared during the dig were now standing again, taller than they could have possibly grown in 2 weeks. Branches hung low where they hadn't before, forming a canopy that filtered the light until the clearing felt dim and closed. It was as if the forest had healed fast, deliberately, and, in doing so, erased all evidence of what had been done there. Sheriff McClure returned to the site herself. She stood in the center of where the pit should have been, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, and turned a slow circle. There was no sign of the excavation, no sign of human disruption at all. Her deputy, standing a few feet away, said quietly, "It's like it took it back." McClure didn't answer, but she noticed something strange. The sound in the air was wrong. Even in deep forest, there's always some kind of ambient noise: wind, insects, birds, the faint creak of trees. Here, there was nothing. It wasn't silence, it was absence. When they left, the sound of the world returned as soon as they stepped beyond the invisible perimeter of the clearing. One deputy later described it as walking out of a vacuum. The loggers, spooked by the disappearance of their own worksite, refused to come back. They claimed their tools had gone missing. Entire chainsaws, gas cans, and spools of cable vanished overnight. One man swore had seen something move between the trees while he was packing up a figure tall enough to brush the lower branches without raising its arms. He didn't return the next day to collect his paycheck. Within a month, the county closed the access road leading into Crescent Pines. Citing ecological preservation, unofficially, no one in law enforcement wanted more eyes on that ground. The fencing around the site came down quietly, without announcement. The only marker left behind was a small weathered sign nailed to a tree at the trailhead area, closed, dangerous terrain. The official narrative was simple: the site had been secured, the excavation complete, the recovered evidence transferred to secure facilities. But internally, there was a problem no one could explain. Samples of the soil taken from the pit had begun to change in storage, the dirt compacted, unnaturally hardening, until it had to be broken with tools. Under a microscope, the particles looked fused together, as though they were trying to return to a solid state. One lab tech joked about it being self-healing dirt. No one laughed. And then there were the reports, quiet off their cord, from hikers who swore they'd stumbled on the clearing by accident in late summer. They all told the same story: they'd felt watched, the air was colder than the rest of the forest, and just before leaving they'd noticed a faint, low hum vibrating through the ground under their feet. The camera would be slow here, no fast cuts, no replays of evidence, just stillness, the kind of stillness that makes you lean forward because you're afraid to breathe too loudly. There's a photograph, grainy, sun-warm, taken at the edge of the lake sometime in June of 1989. 16 faces, some smiling, some caught mid-blink, some not looking at the camera at all, none of them knowing this would be the last time they'd be captured in the light. Their names appear one by one over that photo, each spoken aloud by the narrator: Eleanor Carr, Danny Reardon, Paul Reardon, Leah Hughes, Shiloh Daniels, Mark Alton, Curtis Vale, Maria Santos, Lal Santos, June Park, Willistone, Travis Reed, Emma Caldwell, Nina Brooks, Graham Porter, Holly Dwyer. Each name lands with a pause long enough for the audience to picture a person, not a statistic. Over the names, the visuals shift, snapshots from the recovered roll of film lingering over smiles, glances, and small gestures. Ellie, crouched by the fire, folding paper into a crane. Danny, mid-laugh, holding a fishing rod. Maria, with her hand resting lightly on Lyle's arm. These are not just faces from a mystery. They are people who had routines, quirks, unfinished conversations. The narrator's voice is soft here, but steady. Some stories are not solved. They are inherited, passed down in whispers, traded across generations, growing stranger with each telling. The forest will keep its silence, the ground will keep its shape, and somewhere, if you believe the ones who dream of them, 16 voices are still calling. The screen fades to black, but the audio remains for a few more seconds. Not the low hum from the tape, not the laughter, just the sound of wind moving through tall pines, and so faint you might think you imagined. Eat a single deliberate knock